The streets of Detroit weren't kind to anyone in the 1990s, especially not to a young boy growing up in a tiny apartment above his grandmother's convenience store. But this boy was different. While other kids played video games after school, he spent hours watching customers haggle with his grandmother, learning the art of business one penny at a time. By age 12, he'd started his first venture, fixing broken phones for classmates. He didn't have fancy tools, just steady hands and a determination that burned brighter than the city lights. His grandmother would often find him asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by tiny screws and circuit boards, a textbook serving as his pillow. High school brought new challenges and opportunities. While maintaining straight A's, he built a small empire of tech repair services across 3 schools. Teachers started calling him the fix-it kid, but his dreams stretched far beyond fixing other people's devices. He wanted to build something of his own. College scholarships poured in, but Silicon Valley was calling. With nothing but a beaten-up laptop and $2,000 saved from his repair business, he boarded a bus to California. The first few months were rough, sleeping on a friend's couch, eating instant noodles, and coding until his eyes burned. His big break came during a tech convention where he demonstrated his prototype for self-driving car software. It wasn't perfect, but it was innovative. A venture capitalist in the audience saw potential not just in the technology, but in the hungry look in the young man's eyes. That first investment of $500,000 felt like all the money in the world. But success has a way of changing people. As his company grew from a small startup to a tech giant, the humble kid from Detroit began to fade away. The old convenience store was replaced by penthouse offices. The bus rides turned into private jet flights. Each success added another layer of armor, slowly disconnecting him from the real world. His company's worth skyrocketed to $10 billion. Magazines put him on their covers, calling him a tech titan and the future of innovation. The media loved his rags-to-riches story, but few noticed how wealth was changing him. The patient entrepreneur, who once spent hours helping customers with broken phones, now barely had time for his own board meetings. He built a mansion overlooking the Pacific, but rarely spent time there. Instead, he was always chasing the next deal, the next acquisition, the next headline. His grandmother's words of wisdom about staying humble became distant echoes, drowned out by the sound of success. The young boy who once counted pennies in a Detroit convenience store had transformed into a billionaire who couldn't remember the last time he carried cash. His old friends tried to warn him about his changing personality, but he dismissed their concerns. In his mind, he'd earned the right to act however he wanted. Power has a way of making people feel invincible. As his wealth grew, so did his sense of being above the law. He started small, running red lights because he was too busy to wait, parking in handicap spots because they were more convenient, speaking down to service workers because they were beneath him. Little did he know, Karma was watching. And she was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life, that money can't buy immunity from consequences, and that true character is revealed not in how we treat our equals, but in how we treat those who can't fight back. The stage was set for a fall from grace that would shock the tech world and remind everyone that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is above the law. But on that warm San Francisco evening, as he stepped into his luxury car, he had no idea his world was about to change forever. The celebration at the prestigious Sky Lounge was in full swing. The tech billionaire had just closed a $5 billion deal, acquiring his biggest competitor. Crystal glasses clinked, expensive champagne flowed, and everyone wanted to shake his hand. His security team stood watchfully in the corners, already concerned about their boss's growing reputation for reckless behavior after big wins. "Sir, let us call your driver," his head of security suggested, noticing how the billionaire's expensive shoes were slightly unsteady on the polished floor. The concern in his voice was genuine. He'd worked for the family for 15 years and had watched his employer change from a humble innovator into someone he barely recognized. "I don't need a driver," the billionaire snapped, pulling out his car keys. "I've got my Lamborghini downstairs. Cost me $2 million. Pretty sure I can handle driving it." His words carried that particular sharpness that comes with too much expensive champagne and an ego that's grown too big for its own good. The security team exchanged worried glances. They'd seen this behavior becoming more frequent, the dismissive attitude, the belief that wealth made him untouchable. But their jobs depended on his goodwill, and he'd recently fired an assistant for being too controlling when she insisted he shouldn't drive after drinking. The night air was cool as he stepped out of the club, ignoring the concerned looks from the valet. The Lamborghini's engine roared to life, its bright yellow paint gleaming under the streetlights. He pulled out into the San Francisco streets, where late-night traffic was still moving steadily. The city was beautiful at night, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing with thoughts of his latest victory, of how he'd crushed his competition. The speedometer crept up, 45, 55, 70 miles per hour. Streetlights flashed by in a blur. He weaved between cars, ignoring their honks. In his mind, he owned these streets. Why shouldn't he? He paid more in taxes than most people earned in a lifetime. The light ahead turned yellow, then red. But he didn't slow down. Why should he wait? Time was money, and he had plenty of the latter. The intersection wasn't empty, though. A young couple had just started crossing, holding hands. At the last second, he swerved, missing them by inches. Their shocked faces disappeared in his rearview mirror. That's when he saw the flashing lights. A police cruiser had witnessed the whole thing. The siren wailed, demanding him to pull over. For a moment, he considered accelerating. His car could easily outrun a police cruiser. But something made him slow down, maybe a last shred of common sense, breaking through the alcohol and arrogance. He pulled over, but not with the humility of someone who knew they'd done wrong. Instead, he was already reaching for his phone, ready to call his lawyer, his PR team, whoever he needed to make this inconvenience disappear. Little did he know, this traffic stop would become the turning point in his life. The police officer approached carefully, flashlight beam steady. The billionaire couldn't see the officer's face, but he could feel the authority in their measured steps. He gripped his steering wheel tighter, anger building. How dare someone of such little consequence interrupt his night of triumph? What happened next would be captured by both the officer's body camera and dozens of civilian phones. It would become one of those viral moments that people would discuss for years to come. A perfect example of how money and power can make someone forget the basic rules of human decency and how karma has a way of restoring balance when it's needed most. The police officer stepped out of the cruiser, maintaining a professional demeanor despite having witnessed the near accident at the crosswalk. Through the rolled-up window of the Lamborghini, the billionaire could see it was a female officer, probably in her mid-30s. Her steady approach spoke of years of experience handling difficult situations. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," she commanded, her voice firm but professional. The billionaire sat there for a moment, fingers drumming on the leather steering wheel. He wasn't used to taking orders from anyone, let alone a public servant making less in a year than he made in an hour. "Do you know who I am?" He called out through the barely lowered window. His voice carried that particular tone of someone who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. The officer's flashlight beam remained steady. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle now." Her voice hadn't changed. Still professional, still authoritative. This seemed to infuriate him even more. Around them, people had started gathering, phones raised. Some recognized the yellow Lamborghini from tech magazines and social media. Finally, he opened the door, stumbling slightly as he stepped out. The smell of expensive champagne followed him. He stood to his full height, straightening his designer suit, trying to tower over the officer. But she didn't back down. "License and registration," she stated, ignoring his attempts at intimidation. Instead of complying, he pulled out his phone. "Let me call my lawyer first," he said, his fingers already moving across the screen. "You're making a big mistake here. Do you have any idea how much tax revenue I generate for this city?" "Sir," put the phone down. "License and registration, please." The officer's patience was remarkable, but there was steel in her voice now. More phones had appeared in the growing crowd of onlookers. The scene was being broadcast live across multiple social media platforms. "I don't have time for this," he snapped, taking a step toward her. "I'm calling your supervisor. You'll be lucky to have a job tomorrow." He moved closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of alcohol. The officer took a step back, maintaining proper distance. "Sir, this is your final warning. Step back and provide your license and registration." Her hand moved to rest near her equipment belt, not threatening, just prepared. This supple movement seemed to snap something in the billionaire's mind. "Don't you dare threaten me," he shouted, his voice echoing off the buildings. In a moment of blind rage, he did something that would change his life forever. He lunged forward, shoving the officer hard. The push caught her off guard, sending her backward. She hit her head on the pavement with a sickening sound that silenced the watching crowd. Time seemed to freeze. The officer lay motionless for a moment. The billionaire stood there, his anger suddenly replaced by shock at his own actions. Before he could move, two nearby officers who had arrived as backup rushed forward, quickly restraining him. The crowd's phones captured everything: the entitled attitude, the aggressive behavior, the shocking violence against a public servant. Within minutes, the videos were spreading across the internet like wildfire. The tech world's golden boy had just shown his true colors, and the whole world was watching. As he was placed in handcuffs, reality began to sink in. The officer was being tended to by her colleagues, thankfully conscious but clearly injured. Through the fog of his fading anger and arrogance, he began to realize that all his billions couldn't erase what had just happened. Every second had been recorded, every word captured, every action preserved for the world to see. His phone buzzed continuously in his pocket, no doubt his PR team already scrambling to contain the uncontainable. But some things can't be spun, some actions can't be explained away. As he was led to the police car, he caught his reflection in the window. For the first time in years, he didn't see a powerful tech billionaire. He saw something else entirely, a man who had lost his way and was about to face the consequences. The news spread faster than wildfire in the digital age. By sunrise, every major news outlet was running the story. The video clips were everywhere: the confrontation, the shove, the officer hitting the ground. Each replay brought a new wave of public outrage. In his holding cell, the billionaire sat alone, his designer suit wrinkled, his empire crumbling with each passing hour. His phone had been confiscated, but he could imagine the chaos unfolding. His company's stock would be in freefall, investors would be panicking, partners would be distancing themselves. The police station was surrounded by reporters. Their cameras flashed through the windows, hungry for a glimpse of the tech titan brought low. Inside, officers went about their work, treating him like any other suspect. No special treatment, no concessions for his wealth. For the first time in years, his money couldn't buy him comfort. His lawyer arrived looking worried, not the usual confident strut. "It's bad," he said, running his hand through his graying hair. "The officer has a concussion. The body cam footage is crystal clear. And your blood alcohol level was well over the limit." The billionaire leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "Just make it go away, whatever it costs. Pay the officer, settle with the department, do whatever you need to do." His lawyer shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. Money can't fix this. The videos have millions of views already. Social media is exploding. Your biggest corporate partners are releasing statements condemning the incident. 3 board members have already resigned." Outside his cell, a TV mounted on the wall showed the damage. His company's stock had dropped 40% in early trading. Protesters were gathering outside his corporate headquarters. Former employees were coming forward with stories of his aggressive behavior and growing instability. His PR team's first statement made things worse. They tried to paint him as overworked, stressed from running a major corporation. The public wasn't buying it. Comments flooded in: "Being stressed doesn't give you the right to assault police officers, and money doesn't put you above the law." The officer he'd pushed was being hailed as a hero. Her record spoke for itself: 15 years of service, dozens of commendations, volunteer work with at-risk youth. Her calm professionalism during the incident, captured on video, stood in stark contrast to his arrogant rage. By afternoon, more details emerged. The young couple he'd nearly hit at the crosswalk came forward. They were expecting parents who'd been walking home from a late-night birthing class. Their story added fuel to the public's anger. His company's board called an emergency meeting. He wasn't invited. His phone privileges were restored just long enough to receive their message. They were discussing leadership alternatives. The empire he'd built was slipping through his fingers. Bail was set at $500,000, a drop in the bucket for him, but the judge added conditions: no driving, no leaving the state, regular alcohol testing. His wealth might cushion his fall, but it couldn't stop it entirely. As he was led back to his cell, a young officer delivered his dinner. The same basic meal every other inmate received. The officer didn't sneer or comment, just did his job professionally. That simple act of being treated like everyone else hit harder than any angry comment could. In the quiet of his cell, reality began to sink in. He'd spent years building his wealth, his power, his influence. But in one moment of arrogance, he'd revealed his true character to the world. No amount of money could buy back respect once it's lost. No PR team could spin away the truth caught on camera. The sun set on his first day in custody, but this was just the beginning. His fall from grace would serve as a reminder to everyone that karma doesn't check your bank balance before striking. Sometimes the most expensive lessons in life don't cost a single dollar, they cost everything else. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters as the billionaire made his first court appearance. Gone was his usual confident stride. His designer suit couldn't hide how the past few weeks had worn him down. His legal team surrounded him like a protective shield, but they couldn't shield him from the public's judgment. Inside the courtroom, his wealth meant nothing. The judge, a veteran of 30 years on the bench, had seen it all before. Rich or poor, the law was supposed to treat everyone equally. The prosecution's case was strong, multiple video angles, clear body cam footage, dozens of witnesses, and ironclad evidence of intoxication. His defense team tried every angle. They spoke of his contributions to society, his charitable donations, his role in advancing technology. But the prosecutor's response was simple and devastating. The law doesn't have a different set of rules for billionaires. The injured officer testified from a wheelchair, still recovering from her concussion. Her testimony was powerful in its simplicity. She didn't show anger or seek revenge. She just told the truth about that night, her voice steady as she described how she'd simply been doing her job. "I treated him the same way I would treat any citizen," she explained to the court. "That's what we're trained to do. That's what the badge means." Her words hit home with the jury, who could see the stark contrast between her professionalism and his arrogance. The defense's strategy shifted. They tried to paint a picture of a stressed executive, someone who'd lost his way under the pressure of running a massive corporation. But then the prosecution brought forward the young expecting couple from the crosswalk. "We could have died that night," the husband testified, holding his wife's hand. "Our baby could have died." And when the officer tried to stop him, he acted like he was above the law. Their testimony left many in the courtroom wiping away tears. More witnesses came forward. A parking attendant described how the billionaire regularly parked in handicap spots because he was too important to walk. A former employee testified about his growing pattern of aggressive behavior. Each story added another crack to his carefully crafted public image. His legal team offered a plea deal, a massive financial settlement to the injured officer, donations to police charities, and community service. The prosecutor took it to the officer, who surprised everyone with her response. "This isn't about money. It's about showing that no one is above the law." In a desperate move, his lawyers tried to get the video evidence thrown out on technical grounds. The judge's response was quick and firm. "The public has a right to see how justice works for everyone, regardless of their bank balance." The billionaire watched his defense crumble day by day. The same technology that had made him rich was now his undoing. Every angle of his crime had been captured in high definition, shared millions of times, dissected by experts. There was nowhere to hide from the truth. As the trial progressed, something began to change in him. The arrogance slowly melted away. He started listening, really listening, to the testimonies. He saw himself through others' eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't like what he saw. His final statement to the court showed a glimpse of the person he used to be, before money had changed him. "I forgot where I came from," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I thought money made me better than others. I was wrong." But words alone couldn't undo his actions. The jury had seen the evidence. They had heard the testimonies. They had watched the videos over and over. Now they held his fate in their hands, and all his billions couldn't buy their sympathy. Justice was about to be served, and it would cost him more than money ever could. The verdict hit him like a physical blow. Guilty on all counts. The billionaire sat motionless as the judge read out each charge, each one hammering home the reality of his situation. The courtroom was silent except for the judge's voice and the rapid clicking of reporters' cameras. Back in his holding cell, waiting for sentencing, he finally had time to think. The small concrete room was a far cry from his ocean view mansion, but somehow his mind was clearer here than it had been in years. On the small metal desk lay scattered newspaper headlines about his case. Each one told the story of his fall from grace. I'd guard brought him a letter from his grandmother back in Detroit. She'd watched everything unfold on TV, her heart breaking for the grandson she'd raised to be better than this. Her words cut deeper than any court verdict. I don't recognize the man I saw in that video. What happened to the kind boy who used to help elderly customers carry their groceries? For the first time in years, he cried, not for his lost empire or his ruined reputation, but for the person he'd let himself become. He thought about his old neighborhood, where kids used to come to his grandmother's store for free candy when they were hungry. He remembered fixing phones for students who couldn't afford new ones. His company's board had officially removed him as CEO. The news barely faced him anymore. Instead, he found himself thinking about the officer he'd hurt. She was back at work now, still dealing with headaches from the concussion, but determined to continue serving her community. Her dedication made his own actions seem even more shameful. During the weeks before sentencing, he started reading letters from the public. Most were angry, but some shared stories of their own struggles with power and ego. A few even wrote about how his case had made them examine their own behavior. He read every letter, each one helping him see the bigger picture of how money had poisoned his character. The prison counselor noticed changes in him. Gone was the arrogant billionaire who thought he could buy his way out of trouble. Instead, she saw someone who was finally facing his own reflection, no matter how uncomfortable the view. He requested a meeting with his old school teacher, who had encouraged his early interest in technology. She came, not sure what to expect. I lost my way, he told her, his voice heavy with regret. I forgot that success isn't just about making money, it's about making a difference. The day before sentencing, he wrote a letter to the officer he'd assaulted. No excuses, no attempts to justify his actions. Just a raw, honest acknowledgement of his wrongs and the pain he'd caused. He didn't expect forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned it. The media was surprised when he fired his expensive legal team before sentencing. He didn't want any more attempts to minimize his actions or shift blame. For the first time in years, he was ready to face consequences without hiding behind his wealth. In his final statement to the court, he spoke without notes or preparation. Money didn't make me act that way, he admitted. Money just revealed who I'd become. I used to think being wealthy made me special, made me better than others. I was wrong. True character isn't shown by how much money you have, but by how you treat people who can't do anything for you. As he waited for the judge to hand down his sentence, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not because he was freed from guilt, but because he was finally facing the truth about himself. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. It's never too late to remember who you really are. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. He had burned bridges, hurt people, and lost much of what he'd built. But sitting there in the courtroom, he realized something important. Sometimes you have to lose everything to remember what really matters. 3 years passed like a slow tide in the minimum security prison. The billionaire's cell was small, his bed narrow, his daily routine fixed. But in this simplicity he found something he'd lost years ago: clarity. His prison job in the computer lab, teaching other inmates basic coding skills, reminded him of his early days fixing phones for classmates. Prison had its own way of stripping away pretense. Here, his bank account meant nothing. His fellow inmates didn't care about his former status. What mattered was how he treated people, how he carried himself, how he owned his mistakes. The same lessons his grandmother had taught him decades ago in that small Detroit store. He used his time to write, not press releases or corporate speeches, but honest reflections on his journey from humble beginnings to arrogant wealth and back to humility. These writings would later become part of a program helping young entrepreneurs avoid the pitfalls of success. News from the outside world trickled in. His company had survived under new leadership, though its value had never fully recovered. Some called this karma. He saw it as a fair price for losing his way. The tech world had moved on, finding new heroes and villains to fill their headlines. The injured officer had made a full recovery and received a promotion. She'd used her unexpected spotlight to start a community program bridging the gap between wealthy tech companies and local law enforcement. The irony wasn't lost on him. His worst moment had inspired someone else's best work. Release day came without fanfare. No reporters waited outside, no cameras flashed. He walked out wearing a simple suit his grandmother had sent, carrying a small bag of belongings. The world had changed during his time away, or maybe he had changed in how he saw it. His first stop wasn't his old mansion or company headquarters. Instead, he went to the community center in one of San Francisco's poorest neighborhoods. He'd arranged to teach coding classes to kids who couldn't afford expensive tech camps. The center's director was skeptical at first, but agreed to give him a chance. The kids didn't know his story at first. To them, he was just another teacher, sitting patiently as they struggled with basic programming concepts. He found himself using his grandmother's old teaching methods: gentle encouragement, steady patience, celebrating small victories. Months passed. His classes grew larger as word spread. Parents who initially kept their distance began to see the change in him. He wasn't there for publicity or redemption. He was there because teaching reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with technology in the first place. One rainy morning, the officer he'd assaulted visited his class. The room fell silent as they recognized her from the old viral videos. She watched him teach for an hour, saw how he encouraged a struggling student with the same patience she'd shown on that fateful night. After class, they talked. Not about that night, those wounds had healed. Instead, they discussed the future. Her community program needed volunteer instructors. His students needed mentors in law enforcement. Sometimes they both realized good things can grow from the worst mistakes. His grandmother visited from Detroit, walking with a cane now, but her eyes still sharp. She sat in on his class, watching the grandson she'd raised connect with kids who reminded her of him at that age. Later, over coffee in a small diner, she smiled. "You found your way back," she said simply. He never returned to the tech world's spotlight. His wealth, what remained after fines and settlements, went into educational programs for underprivileged youth. He lived modestly, drove an ordinary car, and made time to visit his grandmother every month. Years later, a journalist asked if he regretted losing his empire. He thought about the kids in his coding classes, about the office's community program, about his grandmother's proud smile. "I lost an empire," he said, "but I found my soul. Some things are worth more than billions." The story of the billionaire who assaulted an officer became more than just another viral video. It became a lesson about power, humility, and redemption. Money, they say, doesn't change people. It just reveals who they really are. But sometimes, losing it all helps you find who you were meant to be.